Hi, this is Doc from Heetland Productions. I'd like to talk with you about the Wavetable Oscillator in Thor. There are a lot of rack extensions that are available that give you new and interesting sounds, but I'm wondering how many of us have really explored in detail all of the things that you can do with Thor. Well, let's take a look at the Wavetable Oscillator. Here I have an initialized patch with Thor. It's got the analog oscillator that has 4 wave types that are available to us. One of them is saw, and let's get a look at what that sounds like. Another is square. Another is triangle. And the fourth one is sine. Now, those also exist in the Wavetable Oscillator. Let's switch over to the Wavetable Oscillator. And let's get rid of this low-pass filter. What we have here is a position knob that chooses the sound that you want to get. I'm going to turn off crossfade for a moment. Let's move this over here. And we'll bump the amp sustain up to 0 so that it keeps going all the time. So at position 0, you have a sine wave. When you move it a little bit higher, you get to a triangle. Move it a bit farther and we'll get to a square. And finally, when we move it all the way up, we'll have a sawtooth wave. Now, this is not particularly amazing, but it allows us to do some things that we can't do with a low-pass filter. So, for example, let's put in this low-pass filter again. And let's turn off the gate so that it just does what it says it's doing. You can see as I open up the filter, it adds more higher harmonics. But it's just low to high. Watch this. If we turn on crossfade so it fades from one waveform to the next, we can go from from saw to square, which, watch. So that takes out every other harmonic. That's not something you can do easily with a sawtooth wave and a filter. So what is a wavetable? It's a group of somewhat related wave sounds that we can slide from one to the next. The advantage of this is it's not a simple addition or subtraction of overtones as you would get from a filter. You can do a different variety. For example, let's look at mixed waves. We'll turn this all the way down. Crossfade is still on, so instead of clicking from one wave to the next, it'll crossfade from one to the next. This gives you a large variety of possible sounds that are you're able to crossfade from one to the next. So let's try some other patches here. This is a bass sound that I've created, and here's what it sounds like to begin with. Well, let's play it in a bass register. Well, that sounds okay, but it's nothing particularly special. Let's listen to the bass sounds. Okay, now I had this at position 20, so we'll put that back where it was. That's not that interesting on its own, but when we put on a suitable bass envelope, which is instant attack, a fairly slow decay, and a moderate sustain. That gives us a bass sound. Then we're going to put some pluck to it. So right now I have it set up that the filter envelope will change the oscillator position. So this means that the filter envelope is going to start here and throw it farther open, like so, and then it'll slowly bring it back to where it was. Let's turn that on. Turn on the filter envelope. That sounds a lot more like an electric bass. Now, let's make it so that there's more pluck. That pluck sound, let's make that modulated by key velocity. So the harder I hit it, the more pluck there is. So softly, but when I hit it harder, so this is a pretty good use of a wavetable to create a decent electric bass sound. Now, if we add a little bit of chorus, that would make a good electric bass sound in just about any track. Let's take a look at a different kind of bass sound here. This is more like a angry sounding dubstep bass. Here we have the mixed waves that I was showing you before. We're playing it fairly low, octave 2. You can hear already that that's a pretty interesting sound, as it is. But let's turn on the filter envelope. So now the filter envelope is going to affect the oscillator position. It's going to move up and back down, and that's going to be affected by key velocity. So here we are with low key velocity, and here I'm going to hit it harder. This gives us a lot of variety that isn't possible with basic subtractive methods. Now, let's have low frequency oscillator affect this position here. So let's come over here into the modulation matrix, and let's say LFO1 is going to affect the oscillator position by about 60%. And well, here's what we have. Now, I've set the rate to be 3/16 for this tempo. My tempo right now is 120, and it's got a delay of almost a second, so it doesn't kick in right away. Listen to this. So remember, probably one of the best things about a wavetable oscillator is that you can modulate this position with the filter envelope, with the mod envelope, with an LFO, or just about anything else you can think of. Now, this being kind of a angry dubstep style bass, it's important to remember that effects go well on this. You're not listening to them right now, but I'm going to turn them on. I have an equalizer that puts some peaks here. Let's see what we have. We are turning down around the 500 range. That is to scoop out the muddiness. We're turning up in the range of 6 kilohertz. We're also turning way up in the 10 kilohertz range, and a little bit in the 6 kilohertz range here as well. Then we're running it through a scream distortion unit as well as a compressor. Finally finishing it off with a maximizer. So here's what we have before all of these effects. Here's with the EQ and scream and also the maximizer. That makes it a lot angrier. So remember, as you were working on this with a wavetable oscillator, you may get something that sounds interesting. Be sure to put some effects on it. I'd like to look at a way that a wavetable can be added to another bass patch. So what we have here is a multi-oscillator set up as a bass patch, and I'm going to play it fairly low. Well, that sounds pretty good on its own. It's a detuned sawtooth wave with an octave, a lower octave added to it. Now, if I wanted to add some more high end or some thickness to this sound, we can put in a wavetable. Let's try this. We'll put in wavetable here, and I've already picked PPG harmonics 1 through 8. Let's turn that on and turn off the multi-oscillator. This adds some sparkle to the sound. Let's listen to all of it together. Let's try to adjust this mixer so we have a little bit more of the high end. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add this filter envelope, and the filter envelope is going to sweep the position, move it up, and then back down in this wavetable oscillator. Gives us a different sound. It's a much more interesting sound than what we had before without the wavetable oscillator. With the wavetable oscillator, wavetables were originally used to store complex sounds in a small amount of memory. This was important in the early 80s when sample memory was very expensive. This wavetable oscillator is intended to sound something like a PPG wave. Those came out in the early to mid 80s. So one of the things you could do with those is take pieces of a sound and store it. For example, the word wow. Let's take this voice oscillator in the wavetable oscillator. What we have here is so that could be the basis of a variety of things. Let's try this. If we make our filter envelope slowly sweep the position up and then back down, and this is what I have set up here. The filter envelope is going to sweep the oscillator position about 82%. Let's turn on that filter envelope and listen to this. Wow. Sounds like wow. 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 So that's a fairly simple use of this voice patch. The interesting thing is, because the filter envelope is always the one that's controlling the position, the wow always takes the same amount of time regardless of whether it's high or middle or low. So we can play this in a variety of octaves and it will always take the same amount of time. You can't really do that with a sampler because a sampler will play things faster or slower. Wavetables are great for bell sounds if you set the appropriate envelope. So we want a pretty immediate attack and a slow decay, no sustain, but a bit of release. There are a couple of different wavetable oscillator patches that are good for making bell sounds. 10 Signs is one of my favorites. Listen to this. Now we can get a big variety of sounds with this, depending on where you put the position. Lower. Take note that some of them sound lower than others. I'm playing the same keys here, but I'm moving the position, so you have to pay attention to that. What really makes it sound like a bell is a combination of the overtones that you hear, combination of the overtones, and especially the amp envelope right here that we talked about. Another one that works really well is 5 Signs. So let's listen to this. I'm going to turn off Wavetable 1 oscillator and turn on the second one. Sounds a bit different. All right, let's set these back where I had them before. Can't quite get it to go where I want it to, so I'm going to hold down Shift as I move the mouse to make it move slower. Okay, now let's listen to some modulation of this. What would happen if I took 10 signs down here? Let's listen to just oscillator 3. 10 signs, but quickly threw the position open and then closed it back down again. I'm going to do that with the filter envelope. So we're just listening to this third one. I have the filter envelope controlling the oscillator 3 position. Watch this. There's kind of a clunk or a pluck at the beginning of it. So that's kind of an interesting sound that we can add in there using the filter envelope. So the filter envelope is opening this position farther up like that and then bringing it back down quickly. Now, let's have fun. Let's turn all of these on, like so. I've set it so that the first oscillator is a bit louder, the third oscillator is a bit softer, and what we get is now what would be really interesting is if we detune them a bit so we have a bit of a chorusing effect. Let's try -6 and +6. Your ear will kind of average these out and say, that's where the pitch should be. So -6 and +6, it'll sound like 2 that are going right down the middle. And then if we have one that's that is actually in tune, that'll sound even more in tune. All right, since we're on the topic of bells, it would be useful to note that there is actually a bell sound on the PPG. So let's come down to our next patch. This is actually a sample of the wavetables that were available on the PPG Wave synth. It's called Bell. So this was pretty good, and it sounds different than what we had before. It sounds different than the 5 signs and the 10 signs. Let's give this a listen. So it's just a different kind of sound. For the very low bell sounds, you may actually have to add a little bit more high end. So to do that, let's add another wavetable oscillator. We'll set it for PPG bell, and I think I've got this set at 51. First one was set at 22. If we listen to both of these together, note that this one is a lot higher. The second one is 2 octaves higher. So that gives us a little bit better of a flavor. Let's add some chorus to this. Sounds pretty 80s to me. A great thing that you can do with wavetables is create interesting pad sounds. Now, what I have here is 2 wavetable oscillators that I've selected that have fairly interesting sounds on their own. Let's turn these off here so we don't have any modulation happening. But the first one we're going to listen to is the didgeridoo. That's actually not very interesting on its own. Notice that I've created the typical pad amp envelope. Slow attack, slow decay to a moderately high sustain, and a slow release. All right. Now, the didgeridoo sound, we have a lot of variety in that. Let's put that back where it was. So there's a good deal of variety in the didgeridoo wavetable oscillator patch. Let's jump down to the voice. We'll turn off listening to the first wavetable oscillator and listen to the second one. Here's voice. Now we've listened to this one already when I got it to say wow a few minutes ago. Let's set this so that the voice is an octave lower. All right, let's listen to the didgeridoo together. It's a relatively rich sound. Let's make it richer by detuning a bit. Let's go +5 minus, I don't know, maybe +8. +8 minus 8. That's a pretty interesting sound. Now let's have LFO1 modulate the position of the first oscillator and the second oscillator. So we'll say LFO1 is going to oscillate, is going to move around the position, first oscillator position up and down, and then the second position down and up. Different amounts, different directions. What we have is this. Now, that's pretty thick and messy, which might be good, but we can make it a little less messy if we have LFO2 doing the modulation. So here, if LFO2 is doing the modulation, what happens is we have one oscillator, one low-frequency oscillator, moving these down all together, regardless of how many voices we play. LFO1 is per voice, so if I have LFO1 moving the oscillator one position, it results in every single voice, each note, each note gets its own low frequency oscillator, which creates a pretty thick effect. But if we have the same oscillator on every single one, that is LFO2, it will be a little less messy because the oscillation is, or the modulation is happening the same for every single voice. Makes it sound a little bit more coherent. So pay attention to whether you're using LFO1, which is per voice, one LFO, independent LFO per note that you press, or LFO2, which is one that works for all voices equally. Now, let's try this. Actually, what might be interesting is if we have different LFOs oscillating them. So that gives us another possibility. We have two different LFOs set at different rates, 3 and, what is this, almost 5. Now, let's try this. Let's add a filter. It's pretty bright right now. Let's add a low-pass filter. I have the global envelope turned off at the moment, so what you see is where it's going to sit. Now let's add a little bit of modulation that you might expect for a low-pass filter on a pad. So I'm going to slowly open up the filter and slowly close it down again, like this. Here you can see what happens. You can see what happens here on the Spectrum EQ. Let's make it a little bit swishier by adding some chorus. That's a fairly interesting sound, and we got it very quickly and very simply using wavetable oscillators. There's one other thing I'd like to show you with the wavetable oscillator, and that's what I call a tone stepper. So here, what we have is the tone is going to constantly change at a specific rate, like 1/16 or 1/8. So here we have this sound here. You notice that it starts off on lower position. It's a little duller sound. Middle position's a little brighter. And it gets really bright on the top end. So let's try this. Let's have LFO1 modulate the oscillator position. Here I'm using stepped random, so it's going to click from one position to the next at a rate of 7.5 Hertz. That's pretty interesting. Now, the thing is, if we have, again, like the previous patch, if we have several notes coming in at different times, do we want them to be in sync? Do we want the modulation to be in sync? In which case we'd have to use LFO2, or do we want each of them to have its own LFO? Let's try LFO1, so each voice has its own LFO. In that example there, we have a especially disconnected example. So let's try this, LFO2 instead, so they all modulate together. So that creates an interesting sound that all of it is pulsing. Every single voice is pulsing together. Now, if we add some chorus to this. That gives us a wider sound. Now let's also add some delay. Now the delay, let's see, what do we have going here? We have a rate of 7.5. Let's set the delay time to be something that's related to that. 7.5, you divide it a couple of times, you get half a second. Let's try this. If we sync this to tempo, for example, 1/4, let's try 3/16. It might be nice to have the delay also sync to the tempo, perhaps a different amount. So this is what, 1/8 triplet. What we can do is do 3/8 triplet. Or if our delay is a lot shorter, or a lot longer rather, we can get a variety of different effects. Enjoy, and I'll look forward to seeing you at the next installment of Heetland Productions tutorials on Reason. Thanks.